Welcome to another episode of Open Door Philanthropy. I'm Margaret Chapman, board chair of Unfunded List, filling in for Dave for a few episodes. Unfunded List is, of course, the organization where we get to review a lot of grant proposals and talk to amazing individuals making a difference in the philanthropic and nonprofit space. And I'm joined today by Dimple Abichandani, and I'm so excited to talk about her work, her book, A New Era of Philanthropy, and also how it relates to someone that, if you've been around Unfunded List for a minute, you've at least heard the name mentioned. Before we dive into Dimple's book and all of her amazing history, I just want to do a quick kind of historical nod to another Margaret. And I promise I don't just like her because her name is Margaret, although it is a big plus. Full disclosure, I did at one point think about just doing a whole episode called Margaret on Margaret, where I just talk to you guys for like an hour about her. But I think this is going to be so much better. One of the things we had on Funded List, we talk about Margaret Olivia Slocum Sage, is she was one of the early women philanthropists, and she inherited a pretty vast fortune in 1906 when her husband passed away. It was like $70 to $75 million at that period. So today it would be around a little bit over $2 billion. Not a small chunk of change. And she immediately started getting just a deluge of requests. She didn't have a grant portal or program officers or anybody else to help her dig through these requests. And so she had this like really simple question of like, how do you decide? Right? I have this wealth, I have this ability. How do I decide what to do with this money? And I think her response helped shape what became one of America's first major philanthropic foundations, the Russell Sage Foundation. And in many ways, I think actually has helped to define the institutional model of philanthropy that's guided a lot of what we do for more than a century. More than 100 years later, so it's 1906 and now it's 2026. Philanthropy is again asking a lot of the questions that she was. A lot of the times in her days, she funded not just charities, but initiatives. She really wanted to reform social causes. She wasn't really interested in quote unquote charity, but in really thinking through structural reform that could invest in long-term change. And a lot of the questions that she came up with for the Russell Sage Foundation was, how do you distinguish between a compelling story and a scalable solution? Can one donor really make a fair decision over all of these hundreds of really worthy requests? And kind of most importantly, like, how do you decide what really matters most? For her, she really understood that she had to invest in society itself by researching the issues into poverty, labor, housing, women's education. It really was professionalizing kind of philanthropy in a way that others weren't at her day. And one of the things that kind of kept coming back to me when I was researching Margaret was that she wasn't just deciding, where to write a check, but really was inventing a lot of these systems. Which brings us to Dimple's work and the work that she's done with this, looking back at Andrew Carnegie in her book and kind of the next era of philanthropy. So just a little bit about Dimple is she is a nationally recognized philanthropic leader. She's a lawyer and advisor. And over the past 2 decades, she has helped multitudes of foundations and donors rethink how wealth can be stewarded in ways that are more just, participatory, and community-centered. She served as the executive director of the General Service Foundation, founded Rise Together at the Proteus Fund, led the Center for Social Justice at UC Berkeley School of Law, and is just a wealth of knowledge about so many things, philanthropic, nonprofit, and just life. So thank you, first, Dimple. Are there other things I should add to that?
That is enough. And thank you so much, Margaret, for having me on your podcast. I was smiling when you talked about the idea of doing a Margaret on Margaret, because when I was writing my book, I I kept having this kind of question, or I had like almost like this idea of here off to the side, I think I want to write a one woman show about my conversations with Andrew.
Yes.
Like, so I think that there's something really powerful as we are right now trying to understand how can philanthropy be most impactful. There's something very compelling about understanding how is it that we got to sort of the models that we have. And I hear that in your description of your Margaret on Margaret.
Absolutely. And I will say that was one of the funnest parts of the book for me, was reading the chapter where you have a podcast with
Yes.
Andrew Carnegie using his on wealth writing
Yeah.
as his answers. So totally not in any of the questions I sent you. I'm curious, how did you come up with that as like a thing that you thought would be fun to do as part of this book?
Yes. Well, the interesting thing is when I started writing the book, it really was centered on this question of what's a philanthropy for our times?
Mhm.
What's a philanthropy that actually helps us respond to these kind of intersecting, what some people call the poly crisis, these intersecting, compounding challenges that, regardless of what you're funding, you need a functioning democracy. You need an economy where people can survive, right? Not the kind of extreme inequality that's growing over the years that we've seen. We all need air we can breathe. I mean, a bunch of the country today is being told to stay inside because of air quality, because of wildfires.
Mhm.
And so I think as a practitioner, I was really seeing that philanthropy just seemed not up to the task. And what became this book was really me wanting to try to understand what would it look like for us to fund in a way that meets these crises. And originally I set out to answer that question by looking at the work that was happening today. Like, what's the leading edge? What's a new generation of leadership trying to do? So Andrew Carnegie was nowhere in that original outline. He was nowhere in my book proposal. But when I was writing the book, I was in a public library in a small town in Pacific Grove, and I looked up, and actually he was right there on the wall,
As,
right?
as he would be in many
As
public
he would.
libraries.
Well,
Yes.
and it turns out that on what would have been his 100th birthday, the Carnegie Corporation mailed these portraits of Andrew Carnegie to the over 2,000 libraries that he helped fund. And that's why in 2024, he was still sitting on this wall. And, I looked at him, and all I knew was like, oh, didn't he write about philanthropy? But I had actually never read his writings. And so that little moment took me to first just wanting to learn more about him. Eventually, it took me to the two essays that we call the Gospel of Wealth. And what I discovered in those essays helped me answer the question at the heart of the book, right? The question at the heart of the book is what's a philanthropy for our times? And understanding what Andrew Carnegie envisioned when he proposed philanthropy in his Gospel of Wealth helped me understand that the philanthropy for our times is fundamentally different from the philanthropy that he proposed. So, to answer your question, I as I was reading, I remember I like read the Gospel of Wealth like 10 times. I just kept reading it because it was so full of
Not
surprises.
super long. So yeah.
It's not super
Yeah.
long, but it wasn't what I expected.
Sure.
And I think that what really struck me was the power and influence that it still has today. It
Yeah.
still today is on the top 50 Amazon philanthropy books every day.
Yeah.
And I tell the story in the book about how when Warren Buffett met a very young Bill Gates, like before he was a billionaire, when he was early in his career, Warren Buffett had a good feeling about him and knew that he was someday going to be very wealthy and very successful. And so what did he do? He gifted him the Gospel of Wealth. So those ideas from 140 years ago are so alive and well in our institutions. and kind of live in the hidden blueprint and our kind of cultural understanding, I found myself wanting everybody to read it. And of course, that's not realistic. And in a book, you can't say, well, what you should really do is put my book down and go read this other thing. And at the same time, since the reason I wanted people to read it is that I wanted them to understand that we must leave this blueprint behind. But the idea that came to me was, why don't I actually do what I was actually doing in my head, which is have a conversation with him? You know, I think that also what I didn't want to do was just offer my critique of what he said. I wanted people to actually decide for themselves, right? And so, in the same way that we're doing right now, I think, the podcast is a wonderful medium of our time. And so I wanted to bring people into sort of a medium of our time and invite Andrew on to say, what did you have in mind when you thought about philanthropy? And then the really great thing is that, as host of my own fictional podcast, I had the chance to actually tell him, how did it turn out? Right? Because I'm living today, I was writing this book in 2024. So I could say to him, okay, 140 years later, here's what we learned.
Yeah.
Right? That actually this tool, in the ways that you imagined it being deployed, it didn't actually help inequality. In some ways, it deepened it.
Yeah.
So people have, I feel like it's funny, people have said to me that people love that chapter because I think it helps them kind of digest history very easily. But also people have said that there's something about the humor in it that helps them actually take in something that is otherwise, like, we don't think of history in a humorful way, right?
Fair. I mean, I'm an I feel like I'm an historian at heart. Most of the things that I approach come from that kind of viewpoint of like, what did we do? Now, what do we do now? So that's why I found it engaging to read as a podcast thing, but also I loved the idea for as an historian of kind of putting a new spin on how to interpret history and how to share something that can be super complicated and kind of a slog to read at times, as very approachable and also adaptable for like where we are right now.
Yeah.
So did enjoy that
Thank you for that. Thank you. And I mean, I'd love to just lift up two of the ideas that I take
Yeah.
on in that podcast, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the reason, to me, the reason that Carnegie is so worthy of revisiting right now is that he was alive in a time that's so similar to ours,
Mm.
right? So you know, he was alive in this time where the kind of economic order was shifting, and it was shifting towards a consolidation of wealth and power being held by very few people.
Yeah.
And he starts off the Gospel of Wealth just addressing it. And that really surprised me. I mean, he starts off basically saying, I know people aren't so happy about this new economic system. And there's some amount of, even, I don't know if compassion is the word, but there's a recognition and a naming of, in this new system, a lot of people are struggling.
Yeah.
Right. So you realize, oh, he's not so divorced from reality that he doesn't know.
Right.
But then he like quickly says, but this system, it's the best of all the systems out there. Right. And what he's talking about is kind of this extreme capitalism. And he goes on to even say, it's right there in the first few paragraphs, this system is the law of civilization. And so I think it's really worth revisiting that today, because we've kind of seen, like, he was there at the kind of dawn of one version of extreme capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've seen it play out.
Yep.
And we're kind of alive in a time that people call the second Gilded Age.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
all basically being like pushed out of our jobs now by the AI billionaires. And, and just like in Carnegie's time, we're being told that we're supposed to be excited about some third wave of philanthropy that's coming. And essentially, Carnegie in his Gospel of Wealth is offering up what we can understand as a social contract, right?
Yeah.
He's saying, I know the system is hard. I know many of you are struggling, but trust me, it's going to be okay. I've got this great idea, philanthropy, right? And then he goes on to say, right away, one of the first things he says when he describes philanthropy, he says, we are going to do, we meaning the millionaires or billionaires, we're going to do better things with this money than you would have done yourself had it come to you in small sums.
Yeah.
Right. And that notion, there's two things happening there, right? One is the small sums that he's talking about is wages.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And they
Yes.
were very, and sometimes today are still very small and compared to what is actually needed as a living wage.
Yes. But I think that the kind of the transparency in some ways, like we miss it today, but he's being fully transparent that he's linking this idea of philanthropy to essentially exploitation and saying you don't actually need this money because we're going to take care of you. It's like this
Yeah.
paternal,
Don't worry
we're
about
going
it.
to
We
take,
got this covered.
yeah, we're going to take care of you, and we know better than you do about what you need. And that idea, I think, is at the heart of so much philanthropic practice and philanthropic culture. And that's something that, in the book, I basically try to imagine like what and offer examples, very practical examples of how we can practice philanthropy today that that takes away this paternalism and takes away these really toxic ideas.
Yeah. And I think one of the things you talk a lot about is that kind of idea of expertise can solve social problems, right? Except that I think when I was first reading it in the book and when I was first thinking about it and thinking about expertise, my head went to, oh, I work with a lot of organizations in my other life where it is top-down expertise. I am the expert in solving poverty issues or water sustainability or whatever. I'm going to come in and solve your problem. And Carnegie has a similar kind of mindset, except that in his mind, the experts are the billionaire class.
Yes.
They're not experts when it comes to the actual issue, but in his mind, because they have money, and that's kind of goes. I think you talk about a little bit the faith mindset of because I have been given money, therefore I must be a good person and be worthy of getting this money. And therefore I am ordained to have this expertise and do the
Yeah.
good things. So, I mean, you talk a little bit about that dynamic, but then you tweak it to talk about like relationships and community, and kind of solving problems from the ground up for with lived experience, as opposed to top down from expertise. And so, I wonder if you could chat a little bit about the importance of that, because I think that is something that we're seeing right now with folks making sure that on boards for funders that we have lived experience members and we engage the actual community of people we want to support at all phases of that conversation, not just oh, we're going to write you a check and now hopefully, we'll see a result at some point.
Yes. Yeah. Um, well, I think, I think anyone that's actually seriously engaged in social change work has had the experience of understanding that the more proximate you are to a challenge, that your depth of understanding kind of the solutions
Mhm.
is greater. And the farther away we are, the less likely we are to actually get it right, when get it right means that we're doing what actually communities on the ground want, right?
Yeah.
So that's that billionaires know best kind of approach. It lives in our institutions in that foundations, and I think this is shifting in our times, but for so long, foundations saw it as their role to set the strategy, and then their relationship to the sector, to nonprofits, was almost a relationship of subcontracting. I have my strategy and I'm contracting with you to go out and implement what I think needs to be done.
Yeah.
And it puts nonprofits in this impossible situation of having to kind of almost negotiate or translate or bridge between what the communities that they serve need, and then what the funders are saying that they want to fund.
Yeah.
And it's something that takes a tremendous amount of time and energy and effort, right, to be able to do that bridging. And then I think when you are alive in moments like this one that we're in, where there's so many crises. I think that the impossibility of that feeds burnout in the sector, which we know is a
Huge.
huge challenge. It's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And so I think the answer, and I think that, part of this new era that we're building is to understand that these resources actually belong to all of us. These resources. So, Carnegie and many of his contemporaries really saw this as like their money.
Hmm.
And so my money, my decision, I can do what I want.
Yeah.
And we see donors like that today too.
Yeah.
And yet I feel like like the shift we need to make, and what some in a new era of philanthropy are doing, is understanding these are resources that are really earmarked for the public good. People who are putting money into philanthropy today are receiving generous tax benefits for doing it.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not their money anymore. It really is money that's for the public good. And that defining of what's the public good, it's so much, it's like more accurate and better and more powerful if it can be designed with community, right?
That's one thing I've seen a lot working with some of the groups I do, either with Unfunded List or in my other life, is especially recently, a couple of the groups I worked with where we have been given the latitude to design programs, like just given the money, right?
Yeah.
We're going to give you X amount of dollars. You know how to solve this problem better than we do. Please
Yes.
go out and solve the problem. But the flip side being, there are still so many of the funders that we do get generous donations from, and the reporting and the metrics, and then the fitting it into this box that they think it should fit into. That unfortunately, so many groups feel like they have to, because otherwise they don't get the money. So it's like, how do you, and one of the things we talk about on Funded List a lot is really bridging that conversation between funder and grantee, and kind of telling the other one what the other one is saying. So having conversation with the grantee saying, we're talking to funders and here's what we're hearing, and talking to funders and saying, we're talking to grantees and here's what we're hearing. Because that's one thing that unfortunately, right now there isn't a lot of cross communication, outside of maybe some podcasts or an article
Yeah.
here or there. SSRI has
Agreed.
had a couple, but
Agreed.
so
Yes.
in some ways, funders are hearing we should be doing X, Y, and Z, but then really, how do I implement that? What does that look like on the ground?
Yes, I mean, I just want to underscore this
Yeah.
point you're making about how little kind of listening and cross conversation there is. When this book came out last year, I was in rooms where I was talking with funders, like many, many rooms talking with funders. And then sometimes I would be in rooms where I was talking to nonprofits and talking to fundraisers. The conversations in those rooms were so different. And what really struck me was how much the level of urgency was different,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We did.
The urgency was is not it's not moving into the philanthropic sector
Yeah.
in the ways that we need it to.
Mhm.
And the pace at which, like, I'll share a quick story. This was in 2025. I spoke at a conference of fundraisers, and the organizer had said to me that they always got about 300 people there. And then the day that I got there, she said, I'm really sorry. We have only about 225 people here today, and it's because of layoffs in the last couple months. And so this was the impact of all of those cuts to federal funding, and also, cuts to funding to the states and everything. It had so rapidly trickled down to the nonprofit sector in this one state that literally the fundraisers, which are really the people who are making sure that your organization has more money coming in and is sustainable, had been decimated,
Oh,
And so I thought about that as I was observing that in much of the philanthropic sector at the same time in 2025, you had all these institutions that were going into strategic planning because that's what we do apparently when things change. But because things had changed so dramatically that they weren't sure enough of what they should be doing. And so they were saying to their grantees, sorry, we know that you need funding, but we need to figure out our new strategy, come back to us next year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I actually write about this in the book as something that had happened in 2017. So I was
Mhm.
sort of stunned to see it again in 2017 when, the Trump administration first came in. So many funders had not anticipated all the dramatic changes that were taking place. And so they just went offline and went into strategic planning. And so that's one of the things that I offer is we can't, every time things change, and especially change for the worse, we cannot have our practice be going offline and going into meetings with consultants, and that we actually need to come up with more than these 5-year strategic plans that nobody uses. We actually need to have a practice of being strategic, which I think is something very different than having like a 5-year plan that's going to tell you everything that's going to happen. It's actually a muscle, and it's built by understanding what are our beliefs, like what are our values, what is our North Star, what are we trying to accomplish? And then you just keep adapting that, right? But I think your strategy should be something that everyone in an organization should be able to articulate.
Yeah.
Like it's a few sentences. An example of a strategy that might make sense today is we want to make sure all of our funding goes to fight authoritarianism,
Yep.
because very few foundations are going to be able to accomplish what they want to accomplish if we are not in a healthy democracy,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So there you go. That's a strategy.
I
Feel free to
mean,
borrow it.
I mean, and as speaking to someone who, full disclosure, I do strategic planning in my other non-unfunded list life, and I think it has a place, and mostly it's for nonprofits that I think right now especially have had to pivot and go in new strategies and new directions because of everything going on. But there's a lot of the need to be flexible, right? And I think that's what we're seeing a lot now, especially is this need, and I've seen it with some funders who are doing it beautifully, where it's like, okay, well, we have to be flexible in this time, but we're going to do only multi-year grants. We're going to have a flexible general ops spending. We're not going to require any reporting other than at the end, tell us you did stuff. Like all of those things that allow the organization on the ground to be more effective with the funding. I am curious, could you talk about it in the book? And it's something that when Margaret was coming up with the Russell Sage Foundation, she was very deliberate about some of the governance pieces and put a lot of thought into really setting up one of the very first private foundations that we have. And you talk a lot about governance and power sharing on the boards. And so I'd be curious, if you were consulting Margaret back in the day, or a new Margaret in the 21st century, what suggestions or questions about governance and this power sharing for the organization would you either hope they were asking as a board setting it up, or that you would advise them to do?
I love this question. And the chapter in the book on reimagining governance in some ways was my favorite chapter to write, because it's a topic that I think doesn't get enough attention.
Mm.
And one of the things that I do in that chapter is I kind of trace some of the history of how did we come to get the model that we have today. So the model, just to say, like, so much of philanthropic governance today is low proximity to community, high
Mhm.
proximity to wealth,
Yep.
right? So I have spoken with so many boards that are comprised of the fifth generation of the family of a wealth holder,
Mhm.
right? As opposed to people from the community that is getting the funding, right?
Yep.
Sometimes you'll have a mix, but more often than not, the mix will skew towards the family, right? So you might have a mix where you've got 3 people from the community, but 11 people from the family. And so that's not actual power sharing. There's exceptions. And one of the stories that I share in the book is of the Calibri Foundation. that made like their when they were writing their bylaws, they made an intentional decision to give the majority power on the board to movement leaders.
Yeah.
And they put that into their bylaws. And when I was speaking to the founder of the organization, she said to me, I wanted to make sure that the movement leaders could vote us off if they wanted to, because they are the intended beneficiaries.
And if
You
we're
know,
not
so
doing the thing that they need, then they need to get rid of us. So we're the thing in the
yes,
way. We are
but
the
that
impediment.
that is so rare. I
That's
mean,
yes.
as I was looking for examples, there were just, a handful that I could find. So the model going back is it's proximity to wealth, low transparency, and low accountability, right? So where did this come from? And so I found that part of where it came from was the founding of the Rockefeller Foundation. And I share the story in the book about how when John Rockefeller set out to found the Rockefeller Foundation, it was the first general purpose foundation of its time, the first large general purpose foundation. Because of that, he felt like he needed a federal charter, sort of like a federal law to be passed. So he went to Congress and he spent 4 years trying to get this charter. And what was different at that time than these times that we live in now is that there was a huge amount of concern and suspicion around philanthropy as a consolidation, a dangerous consolidation of wealth and power in a democracy. And so there was real concern about how can this power and wealth be used in ways that undermine a democracy. And I honestly think that those concerns should be raised more today. Again, as we think about this, all of this like hullabaloo about the next wave, the third wave of AI philanthropy feels to me like those concerns from 1908, 1909, they to me they resonate really today as well. But so anyway, these concerns existed. And so he couldn't just go to them and say, I'm setting up a foundation and I'm going to make all the decisions about what we do with this money. He had to actually make a series of concessions. And all the concessions essentially were around governance, right? So he said, so an example, he said, well, of course, we wouldn't make all the decisions ourselves, right? In a democracy, that wouldn't fly, right? We would have a board, but there, because this money is for public purposes, there would be like a public accountability board
Yes.
that oversees our board.
Yes.
And it's sort of funny to look back from today and see like who he thought would be like public, like it was like Supreme Court justices and it was like the head of the Senate.
Like, of course, that's exactly who
That's
I would
not
want to
like your
receive
everyday
the
people.
public
It was
today.
like that president of Harvard. It was
Yeah.
it was a pretty powerful bunch. But the admission, the concession that the purpose of this institution is for the public,
Yeah.
and so our governance structure must have a seat at the table for the public. That seemed really significant.
Yeah.
And then he said, well, of course we wouldn't be around forever. You know, we would be time limited. We would be allowed to be around for 50 years. If our assets grow in that time, we will give away any of the growth so that we're not growing in our assets and then growing our power as a result. And we would have a one-time exception that if there was a good reason for us to be around past 50 years, we could come back to Congress and one time ask to be around for 100 years, but then we would close our doors. What's fascinating is, and these are just a few of the concessions, what's fascinating is that 4 years of lobbying and all of these concessions were not enough to address the deep concerns about the anti-democratic nature of this endeavor. And so ultimately, he did not get the federal charter. And then, in this kind of twist of history, he went to New York, where he was from, right? And this part I'm filling it in, but because I don't actually know, but one would imagine that John Rockefeller had some good relationships in the New York legislature. Like it's hard
Probably.
to,
Yes. He's
yeah.
probably well connected up there. And a lot of places, yes.
And so he was able to get a charter in New York to set up his Rockefeller Foundation without making any of those concessions. And so I think a little discussed aspect of that is that that is what put into motion this blueprint of governance, right? And Robert Reich talks about this in his book Just Giving. Like he kind of, and he kind of says, like, it's interesting to imagine like what would have happened actually if he had gotten that federal charter, because instead this was our first foundation with none of those like what should have been basic practices of governance, right? And so I share that story in that chapter because, again, I think it's really instructive for us to understand why do we do the things that we do so that we can decide how should we do it now.
Yeah.
And I argue that in that chapter that, a governance for our times is more proximate, it is more transparent, and it's more accountable. And so going back to Margaret, it sounds like she was so focused on, from what you've said, wanting really to have an impact. And I think I would have advised her to basically set a table so that she's actually hearing from the people that she wants to benefit from these resources.
Yeah, and I think that in so many ways, it feels like she tried. And again, she had so it's inundated with requests, right? So at some point, you can't hear from everyone. But talking about a little bit of strategy, like she had her North Star, she had the handful of causes that meant so much to her. And then a lot of them were local. So she did have that proximity to the people she was affecting, in New York, women's movements in the Syracuse and New York area. But then she did go national and she did support a lot of national causes. And I think that is a thing that I think has some issue with philanthropists today is like when you are local, you have maybe a little bit easier time reaching your constituents than when you do have like national or international causes, which are a little harder, obviously, to have that buy-in. Still doable. I mean, we see examples all over the place of national and international funders who do have people with lived experience, people on the ground farming, and I think it's totally doable. You're right that you have to have a little bit more purpose behind it and really think it through as opposed to just taking the static bylaws that are on the internet. You can copy and paste and say, here we go, we've started a fund now. Yeah.
Yes. So when I was talking about something that I just realized I didn't raise that I want to kind of go back to, when I was talking about the ways that Carnegie and his gospel of wealth like lives in our institutions today, for me, the one that stayed with me the most was he had a clarity around the purpose of philanthropy. And it's not one that we talk about enough, but he basically said, we're not going to we're going to do a little bit of good with this, but we're not going to try to change the systems.
Yep. Yes.
And by systems, he meant the systems that he was benefiting from, right?
Yes.
And so in the book, I talk about how we can understand that almost as a gilded philanthropy, like where the purpose of this philanthropy then is to gild, like cover over with fake gold, these systems that are harmful, right? And that is what took me to kind of the central argument of the book, which is today we need actually a philanthropy that transforms those systems.
Yes.
We've tried for 140 years to cover up the excesses and the harms, and that isn't a worthy purpose today.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that stands out about Margaret versus Carnegie a little bit is she really was wanting to invest in systems change. Would I have agreed with all of her thoughts about the systems change? I mean, probably not. She wrote not a counter, but a document like Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth around the same time, focused on women, the opportunities and responsibilities of leisured women, where she essentially talks kind of like Carnegie does about what women should be doing who have wealth and leisure at this time. It does not get the play that the Gospel of Wealth does, as you can imagine.
Women are so invisible in our history.
Yes, but it's, again, do I agree with all of the parts in it? No, because she obviously still has the period for mindset of the home is the most important. You should be at home. And yes, if you have the capacity for leisure, here are some things you can do with it. But her underlying message is really women are about social change and we should be taking care of our sisters and finding ways to improve their lives and from the ground up. So that was really a unique mindset for the time. And I think, a lot of the questions that she was thinking about when she was doing this was a lot like, who do I fund? How do I decide? And really, how do I create that lasting impact that's not just a handout, but a system change? So I'm curious if you think when we're looking at philanthropy today, like, are we asking different questions or are we asking the same questions differently? Or are we asking the same questions the same way? And that's actually part of the issue, right? Is that we're asking who should we fund, and we're actually answering it the same way that Carnegie and maybe even Margaret would have answered it 120 plus years ago.
Yeah. So a question that I hear funders asking today that I think is essential that I haven't seen funders from that time asking
Mhm.
is who are we accountable to?
I love that. Yes. Yeah.
That I think is a very contemporary question and it's essential
Mhm.
because without it, I think that this enterprise really loses its legitimacy,
Yeah.
right? Because we've seen how without that accountability, philanthropy becomes a tool of preservation, of keeping things essentially the way they are by kind of addressing just the worst of the harm, but essentially just propping up the system. So that's to me a really important, a newer question. Who are we accountable to? I'm trying to get people to ask this question of what's the purpose of philanthropy today?
Yeah.
That's like, and that is one that I think um, I think Carnegie addresses that question in part because he doesn't want it to go too far, right?
Sure, for sure. But he
He's
also
saying,
wants to control the answer to some extent. He's
right,
like, I want to
yeah,
define what this is so that I can
exactly.
define what this is.
That's what I mean. Like he poses the question to be able to answer it to be like, and this is what it is,
Yeah.
and put a boundary around it.
Yeah.
Almost to kind of say like, and to be clear, this will not be a radical tool. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
and I think that's something that I I think any tool can be repurposed. And I think that's much of what like those of us who are alive today, we're taking all of these kind of old infrastructures that were built for another time and we're figuring out how do we use them today.
Which brings up like one of the things in your book, and we've talked about this a little bit, but I really, in the fair, I think it was the first chapter or second chapter. First of all, you have the takeaways, like you mentioned at the end of each chapter, kind of some practical, questions to think about or things to maybe do in your own philanthropic world. But one of my favorites is the philanthropy time capsule.
Yes.
And I thought a little bit about that and like, okay, first of all, I love that you use the word artifacts, like artifacts from a time to kind of really what are we putting in a time capsule if we were to do it today?
Yeah.
But I'm also thinking like what would Carnegie have put in a time capsule from his period? That when if we opened it, he put it in there in the turn of the century 1900, and we opened it today, would we actually be that surprised? Like, would we be like, well, I can't believe they did that? Like I feel like there's so many pieces that if we were to open his time capsule, they would feel very normal to us
Well,
today.
that's my whole point,
It
right?
is
Is
very
that
disturbing.
yes, it's very disturbing. I mean, that is my Margaret, you just nailed it. That's why I use like very intentionally use that word artifact to say that some of these things that we are still doing today, we
Mhm.
have to actually see them as an artifact of a different time. You know, one of the things that I cut from the book, but that I had originally put in was I found so Carnegie um, hired this man Bertram to do his funding, to do all of his grant making, and especially to oversee the libraries initiative. So this guy Bertram is the prototype of the program officer, right?
Yes.
And what Bertrand does is, and it's amazing. There are these letters. So people write to him for funding for the libraries,
Yeah.
and he writes them back. And there are these letters where Bertram is like screaming at them and saying, I would never approve this plan. It's so idiotic. And you made this mistake. And I don't like how your staircase
To be
looks.
fair, at least he gave feedback, which
Whereas today, people just don't answer the email. That is true. That is true. But it's like the utter kind of power tripping and lack of respect. And so then he goes on, maybe he was just irritated by getting all these plans that he didn't like. He goes on to write an actual book of specifications of all of his preferences, which were obviously Carnegie's preferences, of every aspect of the libraries that they wanted to fund. And if you didn't do all of them, like if you didn't have the staircase with X number of stairs and certain kinds of lights and no fireplace, which is why all those libraries are so drafty, like you had to do everything, and they had to approve the building site and the plot of land. I mean, the amount of control that they put into that. I would argue that that relationship of it's my money, and so I get to dictate every aspect of what you do with it,
Yep.
that should be an artifact.
Yep.
Like, right? So
Yep.
that's why I use that term to say, like, what are the things that really do need to go into the time capsule, because they're not working.
Yep.
They don't produce benefit in the ways that we're trying to achieve.
And I feel like, a lot of people talk about like the trust-based philanthropy, and that's part of this, but I think it goes even deeper and more, it's bigger than just some, not say just, but then some of the things that I think people, if they were to do a tick box of what are the things that everyone can call trust-based philanthropy, the multi-year grant, general operating support, less reporting, like all those sort of things, that's great. And obviously
Yeah,
super important. But I think this also goes a step farther and is not just on the giving out a funding side, but the internal structure of the funder side,
yeah.
which, I think that's where some of those artifacts really live that we don't see because they're not in the contracts and the applications, but
They're in
they're
the culture.
embedded.
They're
Yes.
embedded. They're in the, yes. That's
Yeah.
why I always say, like, I think that they kind of are in the walls,
Yes. Yeah.
and they're in our culture, and they're in our assumptions about, what is this job that we're doing.
Yeah.
So I've been
Yeah.
doing a lot of work with foundation boards, and I see a lot of this live in people's notions of what it is to be a trustee. What is it to be a steward?
Yep.
So these ideas are still really alive, and they're worth kind of, I think, shining a spotlight on. And then at the same time, I mean, a lot of what you read about in the book is the ways that we are forging something different.
Yeah.
So in the governance chapter, I talk about a foundation in the UK that opened up their board, brought on community members, and eventually, with the leadership of those community members, decided to turn over control of all their capital to the community.
Yeah.
Right. And they were really honest about not even being sure about what that actually looked like,
Sure.
because there aren't models
No,
really.
logistically, how do we do this?
Yes.
Yes.
But it was really powerful. They said that they came to realize that the way that they were structured was almost, and they didn't use the word artifact, but I'll use that. Like, it was an artifact of the colonial system that they came out of, and that the future that they were trying to fund, things would be organized differently, right? That these resources would not be held privately by a few people. And so they said, since that's the future we're trying to fund, how can we become that? So I think that this is an exciting moment, because I think in some cases, like, the emergencies of the moment are making people wake up and say, how do we do this differently?
No, absolutely. And I think sometimes it takes a crisis or a pain point to actually spur some of those conversations. One of the things that, Margaret spent most of her later life really trying to answer, like I said, one question: how can wealth improve society? And we've talked a little bit about that, like that underlying message of social justice and improving overall social change for everyone. And you ask us to revisit that question for our own time. But if there were one question that and you kind of mentioned this a little bit with accountability, but that all of these funders would ask themselves before making that decision of whether or not to fund or not fund, like some sort of underlying, is this helping society? Like what is my overall mission and purpose here in using these funds? Like, is there a question that you would encourage funders to really think about before engaging on that next RFP cycle?
I think that most simply, the question really is this work transformational? Like,
Yeah.
does this work move us towards fundamentally transforming how wealth and power are held in our society? Or is the work might be really important, it might be really needed and good, but is it essentially preserving the status quo? And I think that the reality is that the transformational path, I think it's just really important to state that it's uncomfortable for a lot of people with wealth, right?
Yeah.
It's
It's risky.
uncomfortable.
It's
It's
risky. People don't like risk.
yeah. And I think people with resources hold a lot of fear and like questions about, well, okay, if we start changing this system, then where am I in that future? Where are my descendants in that future?
Yeah.
Um, and I think what we have to do a better job of, and I try to do this in my book, is like, how can we all collectively imagine a future of shared flourishing? Not that like a few of us get to have all the resources and that the price of that is that others don't, but that there's actually, to move towards a vision where we can actually all flourish and that there's enough. I find it so interesting that the phrase that Carnegie uses over and over in the Gospel of Wealth, when he's talking about the money that goes into philanthropy, he calls it excess wealth. What do
Right.
we do with all this excess wealth?
Yes.
Right. And um, it's worth really thinking about that today. Like, do we really have excess wealth? Like, so many people are struggling. And then, a few of us have these jobs of reallocating the excess wealth. It feels to me like the highest purpose of that excess wealth is to move it towards a future of shared flourishing where we don't have, you know, where we don't have like this, what everyone's talking about now, this AI cycle where everyone's going to lose their jobs, but all of a sudden we're going to have a lot more philanthropy. Like that right there just
Yeah.
tells us that something is really off in how we're thinking about the purpose of philanthropy.
Yeah. No, I think the risk, often is considered like this four-letter word. And I was just talking to a client of mine the other day, and they run a program every winter for individuals experiencing homelessness, and we were writing a budget for it. And I was looking over time, and I was like, oh, we need the program. We're going to get the money. It's going to be fine. We're going to support these individuals through the winter. But when you start adding up all of the amount of money that goes into some of these fixes, and I'm like, but the risky thing is to buy that hotel down the street that's no longer functional and invest that money and turn that into short-term housing. The risky thing is to build something over here and provide, structure and support. Like those are the the real game-changing decisions, but they're not set up. I mean, I can't find a grant right now anywhere, any funder who would be like, yeah, let me give you money for that. But I'll give you money to house X number of people one night at a time in your
Temporary, yeah.
building.
Which
Yeah.
is not actually, it's a perfect example. It's not actually changing the problem, right? It's not
Right.
actually transforming the condition. It's just kind of like gilding over the worst part of it.
Yeah,
And this question about risk, it's also who is experiencing the risk,
exactly. And I think,
Um,
Yeah, that came up with my conversation. So if you people listening, if you haven't listened to the podcast with Susan Davis, we talked about that as well. Like who actually is owning that risk?
Yeah.
And like it's you're distributing those funds anyway. Like is that
Yeah.
really a risk per
Exactly.
se?
Well, and this is why, again, it's so important to keep coming back to purpose. Like, what's the purpose of philanthropy in our times? So, I think another kind of idea that has been passed down, and you really see this play out in governance, is this idea that somehow trustees are supposed to maintain or grow the endowment.
Hmm.
And I really challenge that and say, like, no, this wealth, this excess wealth that's come to you in philanthropy, its purpose is to be transformed into something else, right? And so if you're kind of, as a funder, getting richer and richer every year while the world is on fire, you're just not doing it right. Like, I think we need to kind of really revisit our understanding of, like, what is the role? What is it we're supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
And we're actually supposed to be taking this money and putting it into communities and adding in relationships and imagination and hopefully a long runway, right? Like, do the multi-year, do the flexible support, all of that, so that we're engaged in a type of alchemy, right? So that, like, it's what started as excess wealth can transform into a better future for people.
Oh, I love that. Oh my goodness. Like there's so many things that we could talk about. We didn't even get to like the question of power and we talked a little bit about shared decision making and strategic philanthropy. And like there's 100 different other topics I could talk to you literally all day about these things. But I'm curious if there's one mindset shift that when people think about not just this book, but what it represents and what they can take away from lessons from Margaret and Andrew, our two new best friends after this
Yes.
conversation. Like things that we can learn from them, good, bad. I mean, some things they did were good. Some things, I'm not gonna say bad. I'm saying like not what we would want to do today. Like, is there one kind of shift that you're hoping folks carry away from this overall conversation about a new era of philanthropy?
I want people to feel this $2 trillion in excess wealth that's sitting in endowments. I want people to feel like this is capital that is earmarked for a more just future. And when I say that, I want grant seekers to feel that. Like, I want grant seekers to understand that these are resources that are, whenever we talk about the kinds of shifts and changes that people want, like, whether you gave the example about affordable housing, or housing for people who are unhoused. So often in this culture, we're just told that the money doesn't exist. We are alive in a time where the money absolutely exists. And I think the work ahead of us is to figure out how to have that money actually flow into our communities and flow towards a more just future, and to allow ourselves to be transformed. Like, those of us working in the philanthropic sectors, we're unknowingly and too often really embodying kind of Andrew Carnegie's worldview, like his wildest dreams. I
Yeah.
have seen so many things happen in the last year where I've thought, wow, Andrew just would have loved
You would
that.
have loved this.
He would have been thrilled.
So true.
And so it's time actually for the dreams of, like, regular people, dreams of our communities, to be what kind of drives and influences where these resources go.
Yeah. I love that. And I kind of lied. I do have one more question because we talked a little bit about, sorry, I just, again, could be here all afternoon.
Yes.
We talked a little bit about that dichotomy between funder and grantee and that they often don't get to talk to one another. And you are in the unique position to be in both spaces, as we often are at Unfunded List. We go to funder conferences and we go to grantee conferences. And so I think we do get to hear a lot from both sides. We did a conference last year and it was supposed to be about one thing, and by the end, it was all grant seekers. It had turned into a venting session on funders that
Yeah.
we found ourselves in the awkward position of taking up
Mhm.
for funders and being like, well, actually, this is what's going on. So, since you are in that unique position and this is an unfunded list podcast, I'm curious if there is something that from both sides, if you were a funder on the funder side, what is one thing or more than one thing that you would want a grantee to know about you and about how you're thinking and functioning? And then on the flip side, if you're a grantee, what is one thing you would love for a funder to recognize in you?
I'll share some advice that I often give
Yeah.
to grant seekers first. I'll say that. I think that it's really critical right now for grant seekers to ask for what they really need, not what they think is possible.
Yeah.
And to really think about the work much more expansively than what they're told. Because a funder might be like, I can give you a 1 year grant of 50,000. But the reality is that if you're really trying to solve some of the challenges of our times, you need to be thinking in 10-year cycles,
Mhm.
and you need to be thinking about millions of dollars, right? And I think that what has happened is over time, a philanthropy has conditioned the sector and some of our most brilliant leaders to think in small ways and to work towards small things that can be accomplished. Like, okay, let me give you the deliverables for a year, but then I'm not working towards the things that it will take a decade to change.
Yeah.
Just that piece, and to be honest about what you need. When the funder says I can do a 1 year grant, tell them, but what I really need is the 5 year grant,
Right.
right? What can I do to help you make the case internally that a 5 year grant is what's needed right now?
Yep.
So
Help be a
what
collaborator with me. Don't just hand out the funding. Be my partner in solving this problem.
yes, a partnership it's in both ways, right? So I think that I have seen many funders really evolve to understanding that a partnership model is key, and to kind of build the skills and hire the kinds of program officers who are more relational. Nonprofit leaders need to also kind of meet them halfway, and part of that is telling the truth
Yep.
and saying when no, this is not working. The other piece of advice for nonprofit leaders is get yourself on a board.
Mm.
Like, don't just stand outside and critique philanthropy. Like, figure out, start small, like go volunteer at a community foundation to read
Yeah.
proposals or something. But like, understand that we actually need you in governance and figure out how to make that happen. So those
Okay.
are my two pieces of advice. And then the thing that I would say that, so something I see a lot with funders is there's just a tremendous amount of overwhelm right now.
Oh, yes. They're
Uh,
inundated.
They're inundated, and there's some amount of just like frozenness from where funders have said to me, they just feel like this moment is so big that nothing they do is enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think it's really important to get unfrozen. And so it's really important to address the overwhelm, to design, both systems. I spoke with one person who is a special initiatives person at a foundation in 2025 when, so much was happening so quickly. Everybody just reached out to the special initiatives person because people were not neatly fitting in other categories,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
And so, she described how her voicemail box was always filled to capacity. Her inbox, she couldn't keep up with it. And like, this is all very real and human. And we need to kind of support people in feeling grounded enough and feeling like they have the systems that they're not drowning as they're doing this really important work of getting resources out, because that overwhelm can can just be it can be really hard.
Yeah. I mean, I think
Very human.
it's one of the things, and I think especially on the grantee side, it's not always seen like, oh, well, they have the money and they give it out, so that job is so much easier. But it also they are overwhelmed right now. I think one group we talk to normally gets like 100 proposals around, and they got 400. I mean, yeah, we always tell people try and have a relationship with your funder, develop it over time, blah blah blah. But that's also A, easier said than done, and B, the funders are so overwhelmed right now. And so I think yes to all of that. And I appreciate you sharing those two sides because that is something that comes up so much for our folks. So I want to throw it out there if there's anything that we didn't get to talk about that you're like, oh, I really want to make sure we chat about this or that because there were so many things we could have discussed that I just want to leave that open for you for a moment if you're like, oh, let me just throw this one extra tidbit out here that I wanted to make sure I got across.
No, I really
Yeah,
appreciated our conversation. Maybe I'll just share
yeah,
one like that. The book, something that's been really heartening is that people are, you mentioned how there's like exercises at the
yes,
end of every chapter.
love
And
that.
I did that because I'm a practitioner. Like I come out of working in foundations and so I really thought about not just like how can we read about how things might be different, but what do we actually do to be able to do philanthropy differently. So, something that has been really exciting is as the book has kind of moved out into the world, it's just hearing from folks who are doing those exercises in their institution and the effect that it's had. Or I just met this week with someone whose board is doing the exercises together. It's maybe I would just kind of share that the book is it's not just a book to read passively, but it really is about how do we together build a different philanthropy to move towards a better world.
Absolutely. Yes, everyone can build their own philanthropy time capsule from the get-go, which is, again, one of my favorite activities in it. Well, I just want to thank you again so much for joining me today and for indulging my slight obsession with Margaret Olivia Slocum Sage. I keep,
Fantastic.
I keep going back to like in 1906, like she inherited money and had not really had to make those decisions before. And so, like, having to really deal with what she did and then what everyone does today. Like, how do we decide? Like I said, 120 years later, we're still figuring out how to answer some of those questions and how to answer them better today than maybe we did back then.
When you talked about them trying to answer that question,
Yeah.
I think something that's different today that is so hopeful is that we're realizing we don't have to answer those questions on our own. And the final chapter of A New Era is about how the future of philanthropy is collective.
Yeah.
It has to be, right? And so, when you said that right now about Margaret and like those big questions, I would just say like today we know, hopefully today funders know that each of us has an important role to play, but none of us can solve the challenges of our times on our own. And
No.
it doesn't make sense to just be in our own institution asking these questions of ourselves, but that we have to seek each other out. We have to find ways to work with others who are trying to solve the same challenges that we're solving. And I think, pooled funds, collaborative funds are great vehicles. I think organizations that bring funders together to align strategy are so important. And then just the community building that we can do so that we're answering these questions together. I think it's essential. It's an essential part of evolving the sector towards being more community centered.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I love the idea of, I was talking to a state philanthropy group the other day, and they were talking about that, how like that's kind of what the reason they exist is to take a lot of funders from the state and say, okay, you're working on this person's working on that. Let's go together and see how we can work on it together and put more resources, more expertise, more whatever behind this problem because we can do more together than we can apart. And I think you're right. Like, she didn't have, she had one guy, his name was Robert. And he was very helpful. But I do feel like in the time you really felt like you were doing a lot of things. And also there wasn't a lot of model to come before. So kind of making it up as we go along, right?
Yes.
We don't have to do that today. And I think that's one of the real takeaways from all of this is that every generation has the opportunity and the responsibility to do this better,
Yes.
and we can. And I think that's one of the takeaways from your book, and that we can learn from. I always say look backwards to look forwards, like that we can look backwards and say, these are the parts we liked, these are the parts we can leave behind, and these are the parts we want to add to make it better for the next generation.
Fantastic. That's such a perfect place for us to end this
Well,
conversation.
well,
Yeah.
again, Thank you so much. This was delightful. And yeah, thank you again. Open Door Philanthropy. Everybody, listen and read Dimple's book.
Thank you so much, Margaret.
Oh, I did hope you had fun.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, this was such a pleasure. Thank
Oh,
you.
yay. So, yes, thank you for joining us. And we're so excited to have you join Open Door Philanthropy, which is a podcast of Unfunded List. And Unfunded List, of course, is the organization that provides education around philanthropy. And we do that through providing feedback on grant proposals and a variety of webinars and training documents. So, thank you again for joining us. And I look forward to future conversations with a new era philanthropy and the Unfunded List.